You know, for decades we've been told that Iran is this rogue state, this existential threat that must be contained at all costs. But what if I told you that the real story, the one they don't want you to understand, is far more complex and frankly, far more dangerous than anything you've seen on cable news? Right now, as Trump returns to power, there's a secret capability that Iran has been developing, not in some underground bunker, but in plain sight. And it's not what the mainstream media is telling you. This isn't about nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles. This is about something far more strategic, something that could reshape the entire Middle East power structure overnight. The question isn't whether Iran has this capability. They do. The question is whether Trump, surrounded by neoconservatives and Israeli hawks, will be pressured into a catastrophic military strike that could ignite a regional war we can't afford and honestly can't win. Because here's the truth they're hiding. Iran's real weapon isn't military, it's economic, it's diplomatic, and it threatens the very foundation of dollar hegemony and Western control over global energy markets. And that makes it more dangerous to the establishment than any missile ever could. Let me take you back to something that happened in 2019 that most people have already forgotten but shouldn't have. Remember when those drones struck Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility? The mainstream media covered it for maybe a week, blamed Iran immediately, and then moved on to the next crisis. But what they didn't tell you, what they deliberately obscured, was the significance of what actually happened that day. Those weren't just any drones. They bypassed what is supposedly one of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world, American Patriot missiles that the Saudis paid billions for, and they hit their targets with surgical precision. Now, the official story was that these were primitive weapons used by Houthi rebels in Yemen, but anyone with even a basic understanding of military technology knows that's absurd. The distance alone made it nearly impossible. What we witnessed was a demonstration of capability, a message sent not through diplomatic channels, but through the language of precision strike technology that made the entire Western military establishment deeply uncomfortable. And here's where it gets interesting, because this ties directly into what Iran's real secret weapon actually is. See, we've been conditioned to think about military power in very conventional terms. We think about standing armies, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, nuclear warheads. That's the Cold War mentality that still dominates Washington's thinking. But Iran learned something crucial from watching what happened to Iraq, to Libya, to Syria. They learned that you can't beat the United States in a conventional war, and you'd be foolish to even try. So instead, they've built something entirely different, something that's far more dangerous to American interests than any nuclear program could ever be. They've built a network, an axis of resistance as they call it, that spans from Lebanon to Yemen, from Syria to Iraq, and increasingly reaches into Afghanistan and Pakistan. This isn't just about Hezbollah or the Houthis. This is about Iran positioning itself as the linchpin of an alternative power structure in the Middle East, one that doesn't depend on American approval or protection. Now, I want you to think about what this actually means in practical terms. For 70 years, American foreign policy in the Middle East has rested on a very simple foundation. Control the oil, control the region, ensure that Middle Eastern oil is sold in dollars and you maintain the dollar's reserve currency status. Keep the Gulf monarchies dependent on American military protection and you have leverage over global energy prices. This has been the game since Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz on the USS Quincy in 1945. But Iran threatens every single aspect of this arrangement, and they're doing it in a way that's incredibly difficult to counter with conventional military force. They're not trying to invade Saudi Arabia or the UAE, they're not trying to physically seize oil fields. Instead, they're demonstrating that they can make those oil fields unusable, that they can close the Strait of Hormuz, that they can turn the entire Gulf into a no-go zone for commercial shipping if they choose to, and they're doing this not with a massive navy or air force, but with asymmetric capabilities that cost a fraction of what American military hardware costs. Let's talk about what asymmetric warfare actually means in this context, because this is crucial to understanding Iran's strategy. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. We have 11 aircraft carrier strike groups. We have military bases in over 70 countries. Our defense budget is approaching $1 trillion annually. Iran's entire military budget is maybe $20 billion on a good year. So how do you compete with that? You don't. You change the rules of the game entirely. Iran has invested heavily in missile technology, drone technology, cyber warfare capabilities, and most importantly, in building relationships with non-state actors throughout the region who are willing to act as force multipliers. When Hezbollah fires missiles into Israel, or when the Houthis strike ships in the Red Sea, or when militias in Iraq target American bases, Iran maintains plausible deniability while still projecting power. It's brilliant, actually, from a strategic standpoint. They've created a situation where any direct American military action against Iran would immediately trigger responses from multiple directions, potentially closing off shipping lanes that carry 20% of the world's oil supply. And this brings us to the economic dimension of Iran's secret weapon, which is really what terrifies Washington more than anything else. See, Iran hasn't just been building military capabilities over the past 2 decades. They've been systematically working to circumvent the dollar-based international financial system. After the sanctions were imposed, they had no choice but to find alternative ways to conduct trade. So they started accepting payment in other currencies. They developed bilateral trade agreements that bypassed SWIFT. They strengthened economic ties with China and Russia and India, countries that are themselves interested in reducing dependence on the dollar. Now, this might sound boring compared to talk about missiles and drones, but I assure you it's not. The ability to enforce economic sanctions is one of the most powerful weapons in America's arsenal. It's how we've brought countries to their knees without firing a shot. But if Iran can successfully operate outside that system, if they can demonstrate that it's possible to engage in international trade without using dollars or American-controlled banking infrastructure, then they're essentially building a blueprint for other countries to follow. And here's what really keeps the people in Washington up at night. Iran sits on the second largest natural gas reserves in the world and the fourth largest oil reserves. They have a young, educated population of over 80 million people. They have a sophisticated industrial base. Under different circumstances, Iran should be one of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East. The sanctions have certainly hurt them, but they haven't destroyed them. Instead, the sanctions have forced Iran to become more self-sufficient, to develop domestic industries, to build relationships with other sanctioned or sanction-wary nations. In other words, American economic warfare has inadvertently helped create exactly the kind of resilient, independent actor that poses the greatest long-term threat to American hegemony in the region. Every year that passes, Iran gets better at operating outside the Western financial system. Every year that passes, more countries watch and take notes. Now, let's talk about Trump specifically, because this is where things get really complicated. During his first term, Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which was probably one of the most controversial foreign policy decisions of his presidency. He imposed what he called maximum pressure sanctions. He authorized the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which was an incredibly provocative act that could have triggered a full-scale war. So you might think, okay, Trump is clearly a hawk on Iran. He'll definitely be pushing for military action in his second term, but I don't think it's that simple. Trump is actually quite difficult to predict on foreign policy because he's not ideological in the way that the neoconservatives are. He doesn't wake up every morning thinking about how to reshape the Middle East according to some grand vision. He's transactional, he's focused on deals, and more than anything, he's intensely aware of his political base, which is largely tired of endless Middle Eastern wars. Remember, Trump campaigned in 2016 on getting America out of stupid wars. He criticized the Iraq War. He wanted to pull troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. His instincts are actually more isolationist than interventionist. But here's the problem. Trump is also surrounded by people who very much do want war with Iran. People like Mike Pompeo, who was his Secretary of State, and John Bolton, who briefly served as National Security Advisor, are both hardline Iran hawks who have openly advocated for regime change. And then you have the Israeli factor, which is enormous. The Israeli government, particularly under Netanyahu, has been pushing for American military action against Iran for over a decade. They've made it clear they see Iran's nuclear program and regional influence as an existential threat, and Trump has consistently positioned himself as strongly pro-Israel. So he's caught between his instincts to avoid new wars and the enormous pressure from both domestic political allies and foreign partners to take a harder line against Iran. The question then becomes, what would actually trigger Trump to order a strike? And I think the answer is that it would have to be something that gives him political cover, something that allows him to frame military action as defensive rather than aggressive. If Iran or its proxies were to carry out an attack that killed significant numbers of Americans, that would probably be enough. If Israel were attacked in a way that demanded an American response, that could do it. Or if there were some kind of provocation in the Strait of Hormuz, something that threatened global oil supplies in a very visible way, Trump might feel compelled to act. But I don't think he wants to invade Iran or pursue regime change through military force. The costs would be astronomical, the casualties would be high, and there's no guarantee of success. Iran isn't Iraq. It's 3 times the size with more than twice the population, and it's had 2 decades to prepare for exactly this scenario. What's more likely, in my view, is that we'll see a continuation and escalation of the covert war that's already been going on for years, cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure, support for dissident groups inside Iran, more targeted assassinations of key figures in Iran's military and scientific establishment, economic warfare taken to new extremes, efforts to destabilize Iran through its ethnic minorities and border regions. This is the kind of warfare that doesn't require congressional approval, that can be conducted largely out of public view, and that allows American politicians to appear tough on Iran without risking American lives in large numbers. It's also the kind of warfare that Israel is very good at and has been conducting against Iran for years. The collaboration between American and Israeli intelligence services on Iran is extensive and well documented. But here's where we need to be really honest about what's driving all of this, because it's not really about nuclear weapons, and it never has been. Iran's nuclear program is certainly a concern. But let's be clear, if Iran wanted to build a nuclear weapon, they probably could have done it by now. The fact that they haven't suggests that either they don't actually want to cross that line, or they've calculated that the weapons threshold isn't worth the consequences. What this is really about is geopolitical alignment and control over the world's most strategically important region. Iran represents an independent pole of power in the Middle East that doesn't answer to Washington and actively works against American interests. They support governments and movements that oppose American policies. They trade with countries America is trying to isolate. They offer an alternative model to the American-backed Gulf monarchies. And perhaps most importantly, they're increasingly aligned with China and Russia, which means they're part of a broader challenge to American global dominance. This is really the lens through which we need to understand the Iran situation. We're not just talking about one country's nuclear program or even one country's regional influence. We're talking about a fundamental shift in the global order, a transition from a unipolar world dominated by the United States to a multipolar world where power is distributed among several major players. Iran is choosing to align itself with that multipolar vision, and in doing so, they're making themselves a target. Because the American establishment, regardless of whether it's Democrats or Republicans in power, is deeply committed to maintaining the unipolar order. They may disagree on tactics, but there's a broad consensus that America must remain the sole superpower, that challenges to American dominance must be met with overwhelming force, whether economic or military. And this is why Iran's real secret weapon is so dangerous. It's not a specific technology or military capability. It's the demonstration that it's possible to resist American power, to build alternative systems, to survive and even thrive under the maximum pressure that Washington can bring to bear. Every year that Iran continues to exist as an independent actor, every year that they continue to expand their influence despite sanctions and threats, they prove to other countries that American power has limits. They show that the emperor has no clothes, that the supposed rules-based international order is really just a system designed to benefit the United States and its allies, and that there are other ways to organize international relations. Think about what's happened in the Middle East just in the past few years. Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations in a deal brokered by China, not the United States. The UAE has been quietly expanding economic ties with Iran. Iraq, which America invaded and occupied, now has a government that's closer to Iran than to Washington. Syria, despite everything, has survived with Iranian support. The Houthis in Yemen, backed by Iran, have managed to fight Saudi Arabia to a stalemate despite Saudi Arabia having access to unlimited American weapons. And through all of this, Iran has been sanctioned, threatened, attacked covertly, had its scientists assassinated, had its facilities sabotaged, and yet they're still standing. In fact, they're arguably in a stronger regional position now than they were 20 years ago. This is what I mean when I say that Iran's secret weapon is really about resilience and asymmetric strategy rather than any single military capability. They've shown that a medium-sized power with a clear strategy and the willingness to accept costs can successfully resist a superpower. They've shown that you can build networks and alliances that provide strategic depth without requiring massive military spending. They've shown that economic sanctions, while painful, aren't necessarily fatal. And perhaps most importantly, they've shown that there are alternatives to the Western-dominated international system, that it's possible to trade and conduct diplomacy and build influence without playing by Washington's rules. Now, does this mean that Trump won't order a strike? No, it doesn't mean that at all. the situation remains incredibly volatile. There are too many actors with their own agendas, too many opportunities for miscalculation, too many people in positions of influence who genuinely believe that war with Iran is necessary and inevitable. What I'm saying is that the real story isn't about whether Iran has hidden bunkers full of nuclear weapons or whether they have some super weapon that can destroy American aircraft carriers. The real story is about a much deeper challenge to American power, one that can't be solved by cruise missiles and bombing campaigns. Iran represents a successful model of resistance to American hegemony, and that's what makes them such a persistent target. And here's the final thing to consider. If Trump does order a strike, or if we stumble into a wider war with Iran, the consequences will extend far beyond the Middle East. Oil prices would spike immediately, probably reaching levels we haven't seen since the 1970s. The Strait of Hormuz could be closed for weeks or months, disrupting global supply chains. American forces throughout the region would come under attack from multiple directions. Israel would likely be hit with thousands of missiles. The global economy, already fragile, could be pushed into recession or worse. And for what? To prevent Iran from acquiring capabilities they may already have? To punish them for being an independent actor? To try to maintain a regional order that's already crumbling? The tragedy is that there are paths to a different relationship with Iran, paths that don't require war or maximum pressure, but those paths would require Washington to accept that American dominance in the Middle East is ending, that we need to find ways to coexist with regional powers who have their own interests and agendas. They would require treating Iran as a legitimate player rather than a rogue state that must be destroyed or subjugated. And I just don't see the political will for that kind of fundamental rethinking in Washington, regardless of who's in the White House. So we're probably going to continue down this path of escalation and counter-escalation, proxy wars and covert operations, sanctions and threats until something gives. And when it does, when we finally have that direct confrontation that so many people seem to be pushing for, I think we're going to discover that Iran's real secret weapon was preparation. They've had 2 decades to get ready for this fight, and they're not going to fold easily.